The Mississippi River carried many secrets in the summer of 1842, but none darker than the story of a 16-year-old girl whose name was stripped from history, even as her deeds scorched themselves into legend. In the parishes surrounding New Orleans, where Spanish moss draped the oak trees like funeral shrouds and the air hung thick with moisture and misery, 17 plantations burned to ash between May and September of that year. The official records blamed lightning strikes, kitchen accidents, and careless field hands, but the enslaved people who worked those lands whispered a different truth in the darkness of their quarters. They spoke of a girl who walked through walls of fire untouched, who could call flames from nothing but rage and memory, who had sworn on her mother's grave to turn every plantation along the river into a crematorium for the system that had devoured her childhood. They called her the Ember Girl, though her given name was Celeste, a mockery of heavenly things bestowed by masters who saw irony in naming property after the sky they'd never let her reach. Born in 1826 on the Trevant sugar plantation 40 miles north of New Orleans, she entered the world during a thunderstorm so fierce that the midwife claimed the lightning itself had blessed or cursed the child. The old woman would later swear she saw sparks dance across the baby's skin as she took her first breath, though most dismissed this as the ramblings of a woman who delivered too many babies into bondage. Celeste's early years unfolded with the particular cruelty reserved for enslaved children who showed signs of intelligence. Her mother, Marie, worked in the main house as a seamstress, her fingers creating beautiful garments for the Trevant women, while her own daughter wore rough-spun cotton that scraped her skin raw. Marie taught Celeste to observe everything and remember everything, lessons whispered in French Creole during the precious hour before dawn when the world belonged briefly to those who rose earliest. "Watch how they walk," Marie would say. "Notice how they hold their wine glasses. Memorize which floorboards creak. Remember where they keep the keys. This knowledge might save your life one day." The child absorbed these lessons with an intensity that unsettled even her mother. By age 7, Celeste could predict rain by the way smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, could tell which overseer was approaching by the rhythm of footsteps on gravel, could identify every person on the plantation by the sound of their breathing in darkness. But it was her relationship with fire that marked her as different from the beginning. While other children feared the cooking fires and the torches that lit the overseer's nighttime raids on the quarters, Celeste would stare into flames for hours, watching patterns that seemed to speak a language only she understood. The Trevant plantation specialized in sugar production, which meant the autumn months brought the hellish process of boiling cane juice into crystallized profit. The sugar house stood like a brick mouth full of furnace teeth, consuming wood and cane, and occasionally the lives of those who worked too close to the boiling kettles. During the grinding season, the fires burned continuously for weeks, and the enslaved workers labored in shifts around the clock, many collapsing from heat exhaustion or suffering horrible burns from splashing syrup that stuck to skin like liquid death. It was during the harvest of 1838, when Celeste was 12, that she first demonstrated what the old people would later call her gift. A boy named Thomas, barely older than herself, had been ordered to stir one of the massive kettles despite his exhaustion after 18 hours of continuous labour. His grip faltered, and he fell forward toward the boiling syrup. Witnesses would later swear they saw Celeste standing 20 feet away, thrust her hands toward the kettle, and somehow pull the flames themselves sideways, creating a wall of fire that pushed Thomas backward to safety. The overseer, drunk on rum and the power of his position, saw only a slave boy falling backward from his post and administered 20 lashes as punishment for laziness. But the enslaved workers who witnessed the incident began watching Celeste with a mixture of hope and fear. Marie recognized the danger in her daughter's growing reputation. Strange gifts, whether real or imagined, marked enslaved people as threats to the order of plantation life. She tried to redirect Celeste's intensity towards safer channels, teaching her healing herbs and kitchen work, but the girl's attention always returned to fire. She would hold her hands over candle flames without flinching, would stand closer to the cooking fires than anyone else could bear, would sometimes be found in the morning covered in ash from sitting too close to dying embers through the night. The event that transformed Celeste from unusual child to harbinger of destruction occurred in March of 1842. Jacques Trevant, the plantation owner's eldest son, had developed what he called an interest in her. At 16, Celeste had grown into a young woman whose beauty could not be hidden by rough clothing or exhaustion. Jacques, home from university in Paris where he'd studied philosophy and other useless things, decided she would become his personal project. He would educate her, he declared, prove that with proper guidance even the enslaved could be elevated to near humanity. The education Jacques provided took place in a storage room behind the smokehouse, and it consisted primarily of lessons in suffering that no human should endure. For 3 weeks Celeste endured his attentions in silence, knowing that resistance would only bring punishment not just to herself, but to her mother. But on the night of March 27th, something inside her finally cracked like wood in a furnace, releasing something that had been building pressure for 16 years. The smokehouse caught fire at exactly midnight, the flames spreading with impossible speed to the nearby kitchen, then to the cotton stores, then to the main house itself. The fire moved against the wind, defying natural explanation, seeking out specific buildings while leaving others untouched. Jacques Trevant was found the next morning in what remained of his father's study, his body unmarked by flames but dead from what the parish doctor described as pure terror. His eyes remained open, staring at something no living person could see, and his hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. Celeste disappeared that night, walking away from the burning plantation as calmly as if she were taking an evening stroll. But before leaving, she did something that would become her signature, a detail that would connect the 17 fires that followed. In the ash of the burned kitchen garden, she drew a symbol that Marie had taught her, an old sign from Africa that meant justice comes with mourning. The authorities would later mistake it for random marks in the ash, but the enslaved people knew better. They knew it was a promise and a warning. The second fire came 2 weeks later at the Dubois plantation, 20 miles downriver. The Dubois family prided themselves on their refined cruelty, maintaining a punishment room equipped with devices they'd imported from medieval museums in Europe. The night their mansion burned, witnesses reported seeing a young woman walking through the flames themselves untouched by the heat, placing her hands on support beams and watching them ignite at her touch. The fire consumed everything except the slave quarters, which remained miraculously untouched despite being downwind from the main conflagration. By the third fire at the Merchant Cotton Empire, a pattern had emerged that terrified the plantation owners along the river. Each fire began at midnight, spread in defiance of wind patterns and natural fire behavior, and left behind that same symbol in the ash. The enslaved people began to speak of the Ember Girl in hushed whispers, some calling her a conjure woman, others believing she was a spirit of vengeance made flesh. But most remarkable was what happened in the days before each fire, a detail that wouldn't be understood until much later. Celeste didn't simply arrive and burn. She spent days, sometimes weeks, working at each plantation under assumed names, using forged papers that seemed to materialize from nowhere. She would work in the kitchens or the fields, would tend to sick children in the quarters, would share meals and stories with the enslaved families. She was gathering something more than information. She was collecting grievances like kindling, each story of cruelty adding fuel to the inferno she was building in her heart. At the Riverside Plantation, the fourth to burn, she worked for 3 weeks as a laundress. The other women noticed that clothes she washed seemed to carry warmth long after they dried, that water she heated reached boiling faster than it should, that her presence made the wash-house uncomfortably warm, even on cool mornings. But they said nothing, because they also noticed that children's fevers broke when she tended them, that the overseer's whip seemed to miss its mark when she was watching, that hope spread through the quarters like heat from a stove, The overseer at Riverside, a man named Garrett who collected fingers from runaways as trophies, was found after the fire in the middle of the cane field, untouched by flames but dead nonetheless. His body was discovered in a circle of ash 30 feet in diameter. The cane around him burned to nothing while he remained physically intact. The doctor who examined him found no cause of death except what he described in his report as complete systemic failure, as if every organ had simply stopped functioning simultaneously. The enslaved workers who found him noted that his trophy collection, that grotesque necklace of dried fingers, had been burned to ash while still around his neck, leaving a perfect black circle on his throat. As spring turned to summer, the fires accelerated. The Belmont Plantation, famous for breeding slaves like livestock and selling children away from mothers as soon as they could walk, burned so hot that the iron shackles in their punishment house melted into puddles of metal. The Ashford estate, where the owner's wife entertained guests by forcing enslaved people to fight each other for sport, saw its grand ballroom consumed by flames that witnesses swore took the shape of dancing figures, writhing in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Local authorities, overwhelmed and terrified, brought in investigators from New Orleans. These men, educated in modern detection methods, searched for rational explanations. They tested for accelerants, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, traced the movement of suspicious persons along the river. But their investigation was hampered by what they called a conspiracy of silence among the enslaved population. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. No one could explain why they sometimes heard singing in the night before a plantation burned, a woman's voice carrying a melody that seemed to come from the fire itself. The 10th plantation to burn belonged to Judge Cornelius Wade, who had made his fortune not just from sugar, but from writing the very laws that codified human bondage in Louisiana. His mansion had stood for 60 years, built from cypress wood that was supposedly resistant to fire. It burned in less than an hour, the flames so intense that glass windows melted and ran like tears down the brick facade. But the most unsettling detail was found in Wade's personal study, where his collection of legal documents had been reduced to ash except for one page, a deed of sale for a woman named Marie and her infant daughter Celeste, sold away from the Trevant plantation years before their supposed arrival there. This discovery led investigators to a terrible realization. The girl they were hunting had been sold multiple times as a child, passed between plantations like currency, separated from her mother again and again only to be reunited and sold together once more. The trauma of being repeatedly torn apart and reunited had created something unprecedented. A person who had experienced the full spectrum of slavery's cruelties before she could even read, though somehow she had learned that too. The authorities tried to suppress this information, understanding that it would generate sympathy for their arsonist. But the enslaved community already knew. They had always known that monsters were made, not born, and that the plantation system was exceptionally skilled at creating the very forces that would eventually destroy it. The Ember Girl wasn't just burning buildings, she was burning the myth of the contented slave, the lie of benevolent ownership, the fiction that human beings could be property without consequence. By August, panic had settled over the plantation belt like smoke from distant fires. Owners hired additional guards, invested in fireproofing materials, kept barrels of water stationed throughout their property. Some families abandoned their estates entirely, fleeing to New Orleans or Mobile until the threat passed. But those who stayed began to notice disturbing patterns. Dogs would howl for hours before a fire. Birds would abandon their roosts, flying away in great clouds days before a plantation burned. The Mississippi River itself seemed to reflect flames that hadn't yet been lit, showing orange and gold in its muddy waters under the moonlight. The 15th plantation to burn belonged to the Whitmore family, who had made their fortune introducing new efficiency methods to cotton production. They had calculated exactly how many calories an enslaved person needed to survive while producing maximum labor, had determined the optimal ratio of punishment to productivity, had turned human suffering into a mathematical equation. Their plantation burned in a perfect spiral pattern, starting from the outside and working inward like a closing fist, trapping the family in the centre until the last possible moment. They survived, but what they had experienced in those final minutes before rescue left them unable to speak of it. The youngest Whitmore daughter would only say that she had seen her future in the flames, and it was empty. It was after the Whitmore fire that Celeste made her first and only public appearance during her campaign. A gathering of enslaved people from multiple plantations, ostensibly for a funeral, but actually a revolutionary meeting, was surprised when she walked out of the tree line at dusk. Those who were there would later describe her differently, some saying she was tall, others insisting she was small, some claiming her eyes were yellow like a cat's, others swearing they were black as coal. But all agreed on one detail. She radiated heat like a stove, the air around her shimmering like summer pavement. She spoke for less than 5 minutes, her voice carrying despite being barely above a whisper. She told them that the fires were not random, not vengeance, but surgery. She was cutting out infected tissue, she said, removing the rot that poisoned the land. She told them that every plantation that burned had been chosen for specific reasons, specific cruelties that demanded specific responses. She told them that she had made a promise to her mother, who had died trying to protect her from Jacques Trevant, a promise that 17 plantations would burn, one for each year of her life, plus one for the year her childhood was murdered. When someone asked her how she commanded the flames, she laughed, a sound like wood crackling in a fireplace. She said fire was just rapid transformation, freedom at the molecular level, matter breaking free from the bonds that contained it. She said every enslaved person carried fire inside them, most just never learned how to let it out. Then she demonstrated, holding out her hand and producing a flame that danced on her palm without burning her skin, a flame that seemed to have weight and substance, that moved like a living thing. She told them about the last 2 plantations on her list, the Caldwell place, where medical experiments were conducted on enslaved people to test theories about racial difference, theories that required vivisection and deliberate infection with diseases, and finally the return to Trevant, to complete the circle, to finish what had started in that storage room behind the smokehouse. She asked them to stay away from these places, to warn any enslaved people there to flee if they could. Then she walked back into the forest, and within seconds the trees where she had stood caught fire, burned for exactly 1 minute, then extinguished themselves, leaving the trunks unmarked. The Caldwell plantation burned 3 nights later, during a thunderstorm that should have made fire impossible. Lightning struck the same building 17 times, each strike igniting a fire that water couldn't extinguish. The rain itself seemed to feed the flames as if the natural order had been reversed. Dr. Caldwell's laboratory, with its collection of preserved organs and detailed documentation of his experiments, burned so completely that not even ash remained, just a patch of ground that would never grow anything again. As August turned to September, only one name remained on Celeste's list. The Trevant plantation had been rebuilt after the first fire, grander than before, a monument to resilience and defiance. Old Jacques Trevant had hired a small army of guards, had installed water pumps from New Orleans, had even brought in a priest to bless the grounds against evil. But the enslaved people who still worked there knew these preparations were useless. They had seen the signs, the way shadows fell at wrong angles, the way the air tasted of copper and ash, the way flames in the fireplace sometimes showed scenes that hadn't happened yet. On the night of September 13th, 1842, the 17th fire began. But this one was different. Instead of starting at midnight, it began at sunset, the flames seeming to emerge from the sun itself as it touched the horizon. Instead of spreading quickly, the fire moved with deliberate slowness, like it was savouring each board, each brick, each memory embedded in the structure. The enslaved workers had already fled, warned by dreams or instinct or messages that seemed to arrive on the wind itself. Old Jacques Trevant stood on his lawn, watching his empire burn for the second time, when Celeste emerged from the flames of the main house. She walked through the front door as calmly as a guest arriving for dinner, the fire parting around her like curtains. She was carrying something in her arms, and as she approached, Trevant saw it was a painting, the portrait of his son that had hung in the study. But as she came closer, the painting changed, showing not his son, but all the faces of all the people who had died on his plantation, their eyes following him with expressions of patient judgment. They say she spoke to him then, though what she said was never recorded because Trevant would never speak of it. Some claim she told him the names of every person who had died under his ownership. Others believe she showed him visions in the flames, made him experience what they had experienced, made him feel what they had felt. Whatever transpired, when the sun rose the next morning, Trevant was found alive but fundamentally changed. His hair had turned white, his eyes had lost the ability to focus, and he would spend the remaining years of his life giving away his fortune to abolition causes, and drawing the same symbol over and over, the African sign for justice that Celeste had left at every fire. The morning after the last fire, fishermen on the Mississippi reported seeing a young woman walking on the water itself, moving downriver toward the Gulf. They said she left footprints of fire on the river's surface that burned for exactly 17 seconds before disappearing. Others claimed to see her boarding a ship bound for Haiti, or walking into the bayous where the Maroons lived free, or ascending into the sky itself on a ladder made of smoke. But the truth, as often happens, was both simpler and stranger than legend. Celeste had indeed left Louisiana, but not through any supernatural means. She had walked away like any other person, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back, and the memories of 17 plantations reduced to ash. She travelled north, some say, following the drinking gourd to freedom. Others insist she went south, to the Caribbean islands where revolution had already succeeded. A few claim she never left at all, that she still walks the back roads of Louisiana, appearing wherever cruelty needs to be answered with fire. What became undeniable was the change her campaign had wrought. The 17 fires had done more than destroy property. They had destroyed the myth of invulnerability that the plantation system relied upon. If a single young woman could reduce 17 pillars of the southern economy to ash and smoke, what might happen if others discovered their own fire? Insurance companies began refusing to cover plantations in certain areas. Investors pulled their money from agricultural ventures. The cost of security measures ate into profits that were already being questioned by a growing abolition movement. The enslaved community developed a saying that spread from plantation to plantation, coded in spirituals and work songs: "Fire ain't evil, fire just is. Like freedom ain't good or bad, it just is." What matters is who's holding the match. They would draw Celeste's symbol in dirt with their toes, would see her face in smoke from cooking fires, would tell their children about the girl who proved that power could burn in any hands, not just those that held the whip. The historical record, maintained by those who had reasons to minimize the impact of the 17 fires, lists them as separate incidents, unfortunate accidents that happened to occur in the same year. Official causes were recorded as lightning strikes, kitchen accidents, slave carelessness, and acts of God. The total damage was estimated at over $3 million in 1842 currency, equivalent to nearly $100 million today. But no cause was ever definitively proven, no perpetrator ever captured, no explanation ever provided for the physical impossibilities that witnesses described. Modern historians have attempted to explain the Ember Girl phenomenon through various lenses. Some suggest mass hysteria, a shared delusion among traumatized people seeking hope in hopeless circumstances. Others propose that multiple fires were started by different people and attributed to a single mythical figure. A few have noted the unusual weather patterns of 1842, the drought conditions that would have made fires more likely to spread. But none of these explanations account for all the documented anomalies, the fires that burned in rain, the flames that moved against wind, the precise targeting of specific buildings while others remained untouched. In certain parishes of Louisiana, on quiet nights when the air hangs still and heavy, people still report seeing strange lights in abandoned cane fields, flames that dance without fuel, that form patterns like writing in a language no one can read. Investigators find nothing but patches of warm earth, soil that holds heat longer than it should, as if something burning underground is slowly working its way to the surface. They file their reports, mark the incidents as unexplained, and try not to think about what might be building pressure beneath the weight of buried history. The abandoned ruins of the 17 plantations became pilgrimage sites for a while, places where formerly enslaved people would leave offerings and prayers. But over time, nature reclaimed most of them, vines and moss covering the burned brick and scorched stone. Yet even now, nothing grows quite right in those places. Trees twist away from certain spots, animals avoid specific clearings, and the earth itself seems to remember the intensity of heat that once transformed everything it touched. Some nights, fishermen on the Mississippi claim they still see her, not walking on water but reflected in it, a figure made of flame that appears in the river's surface when the moon is dark and the air smells of approaching storm. They say if you look directly at the reflection, you can see the 17 plantations burning in sequence, each fire containing the faces of those who suffered there, finally free in the transformation of flame. But if you look too long, they warn, you'll start to feel heat on your own skin, start to smell smoke that isn't there, start to understand that some forms of justice burn slowly but never truly extinguish. There are those who search for evidence of what really happened during the burning summer of 1842. They comb through property records, interview descendants of survivors, analyze soil samples from the burn sites for traces of accelerants or unusual compounds. They've found anomalies, certainly. Soil that shows evidence of temperatures far exceeding what wood fires could produce. Glass melted in patterns that suggest directed heat rather than random fire spread. Foundations cracked in ways that indicate explosive force from below rather than collapse from above. But the most intriguing discovery came in 2007, when Hurricane Katrina's flooding exposed a previously hidden basement beneath what had been the Trevant plantation. Inside, investigators found a collection of journals, not Celeste's, but those of enslaved people who had witnessed the fires. These accounts, written in various hands and hidden for over a century, tell remarkably consistent stories. They describe not just the fires, but the days leading up to them, the subtle changes in air pressure, the way metal objects would grow warm to the touch, the dreams that came to everyone in the quarters showing the same image, a girl walking through flames, carrying justice in her hands like a burning book. One journal, written by a man named Samuel who worked as a blacksmith, provides perhaps the most detailed account of Celeste herself. He describes meeting her 3 days before the riverside plantation burned, when she came to have chains removed. The chains, he wrote, were not physical but somehow still required his tools to break. He said that as he worked she told him about the chemistry of combustion, about how everything that exists wants to return to its simplest form, how civilization itself is just a temporary arrangement of atoms fighting against entropy. She told him that slavery was an attempt to chain not just bodies, but the very force of change itself, and that such attempts always failed, sometimes quickly in revolution, sometimes slowly in decay, but always inevitably in fire. Samuel's account continues with a detail that no other source mentions. He claims that Celeste showed him how to create what she called cold fire, flames that burned without heat, that could destroy without warming, that could consume selectively based on the intentions of the person who lit them. She taught him this, she said, because the 17 plantations were just the beginning, a demonstration of possibility rather than a complete solution. Others would need to carry their own flames forward, in their own ways, at their own times. He never says whether he used this knowledge, only that he passed it on before he died, and that somewhere someone still carries it. The insurance records from 1842 and 1843 show a massive shift in how plantations were valued and protected. New clauses appeared in policies, excluding coverage for fires of unknown origin or those that exhibited certain characteristics. The list of these characteristics preserved in corporate archives reads like a catalogue of impossibilities: fires that burn without consuming, flames that move against natural air currents, combustion occurring in absence of oxidizable material, thermal damage inconsistent with exposure duration. These companies, focused solely on profit and loss, had been forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal fire had stalked the plantations of Louisiana. The Catholic Church's records from the period are equally telling. Multiple priests reported being called to bless plantations against evil, to perform exorcisms on land itself. Their reports, filed in diocesan archives, describe phenomena that challenge theological explanation: fire that cast shadows of things that weren't there, smoke that formed words in languages that predated human speech, heat that came from below the earth rather than from any visible flame. Several priests resigned their positions after these encounters, leaving notes saying they had seen proof that divine justice sometimes wore faces the church wouldn't recognize. Perhaps most remarkably, the story of the Ember Girl influenced the coded communication systems that enslaved people used to organize resistance and escapes. Fire became a symbol not just of destruction but of transformation. Spirituals about Moses and the burning bush took on new meanings. References to Pentecost and tongues of flame became codes for meetings and plans. The Underground Railroad developed a route called the Ash Path, which followed the locations of the 17 burned plantations, using their ruins as navigation points toward freedom. In the years immediately following 1842, there was a marked increase in plantation fires across the South, most smaller in scale but following similar patterns. Specific buildings targeted while others were spared, fires that started simultaneously in multiple locations, symbols left in ash that resembled the mark Celeste had used. Authorities tried to suppress news of these incidents, understanding that the idea of the Ember Girl was spreading like its own kind of fire, inspiring others to discover their own relationships with flame and freedom. The Civil War, when it came, brought different fires, artillery and torches rather than mysterious combustion. But veterans of Sherman's march reported strange incidents, moments when fires behaved unexpectedly, when flames seemed to seek out specific targets with impossible precision. Some claimed to have seen a woman walking through the burning cities, not participating but observing, as if checking that a job she had started was being properly finished. These reports were dismissed as battle fatigue, hallucinations brought on by smoke and trauma. But the men who made them insisted until their deaths that they had seen the Ember Girl, older but unmistakable, walking through war zones like a general surveying her battlefield. The Reconstruction period brought its own violence and its own fires, the burning of freedmen's schools and churches, the torches of night riders spreading terror. But there were also other fires, defensive ones, that protected rather than destroyed. Communities reported fires that formed walls around threatened buildings, flames that drove off attackers without being lit by any visible hand, heat that rose from the ground itself to create barriers of superheated air. The perpetrators of racial violence began to report nightmares of burning, of a woman's voice telling them that every cruelty created its own flame, and that eventually everyone had to face the fires they had lit in others. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the story of the Ember Girl evolved from history to legend to something approaching myth. But in Louisiana, particularly in the parishes where the 17 plantations had stood, the story remained immediate and present. Children were warned not to play in certain fields where the ground still held heat. Builders were advised against using bricks from the ruins, as structures built with them showed a tendency to spontaneous combustion. Farmers noted that sugar cane grown on those lands yielded syrup with a bitter, smoky taste that no amount of processing could remove. The civil rights movement of the 1960s saw a resurgence of interest in the Ember Girl story. activists drew parallels between her targeted resistance and their own strategic protests. The symbols she had left at each fire scene began appearing at sit-ins and marches, drawn in chalk on sidewalks or painted on protest signs. When someone asked what it meant, the answer was always the same: justice comes with morning. The phrase became a rallying cry, a reminder that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, could survive the heat of determined resistance. Modern forensic scientists who have studied the available evidence from the 1842 fires have proposed various theories. Some suggest Celeste discovered or created an early form of napalm using available materials. Others propose she understood principles of thermodynamics that weren't formally documented until decades later. A few have noted that certain fungi and bacteria can generate enough heat to cause spontaneous combustion under specific conditions, and that someone with sufficient knowledge might have cultivated and deployed such organisms. But these scientific explanations, even if true, don't address the aspects of the story that transcend chemistry and physics. They don't explain the documented changes in animal behavior before the fires, the consistent reports of prophetic dreams, the symbols that appeared in ash with mathematical precision. They don't account for the testimonies of survivors who insisted they heard voices in the flames, telling stories of every person who had suffered on that land, naming names that had never been recorded in any ledger or document. Paranormal investigators have their own theories, suggesting that trauma itself can manifest physically under certain conditions, that the accumulated suffering of generations crystallized into something that could manipulate energy and matter. They point to similar phenomena at other sites of historical atrocity, places where the normal laws of physics seem suspended, where the past refuses to remain buried. But even these explanations feel inadequate when confronted with the specificity and intentionality of the 17 fires. The truth, if there is a single truth, remains elusive. What can be said with certainty is that between May and September of 1842, 17 plantations burned along the Mississippi River. That these fires exhibited characteristics that defied conventional explanation. That they targeted specific individuals and institutions central to the maintenance of slavery. That they inspired both terror in oppressors and hope in the oppressed. And that at the centre of all these events was a young woman named Celeste, who had discovered that fire could be more than destruction, it could be transformation, liberation, and justice all at once. Today, the sites of the 17 plantations are marked by historical plaques that mention the fires only in passing, focusing instead on architectural details and economic impact. But locals know the real history. They can point out the spots where nothing grows quite right, where compasses spin wildly, where the temperature drops or rises without explanation. They tell their children the story of the Ember Girl not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that power takes many forms, that resistance finds its own methods, and that sometimes justice burns bright enough to be seen across centuries. In New Orleans, in a small museum dedicated to African American history, there's a single display case that most visitors overlook. It contains a piece of melted glass from the Trevant plantation, twisted into a shape that resembles a running figure. The placard simply says, "Artifact from 1842 fire, donor anonymous." But those who know the story recognize it for what it is, evidence of heat so intense it transformed solid matter into something approaching art, or perhaps prayer, or perhaps warning. The security guard who works nights at the museum, an elderly man whose great-great-grandmother survived the burning of the Riverside plantation, says that sometimes, usually around midnight, that piece of glass glows faintly from within. Not enough to trigger alarms or attract attention, just enough to suggest that somewhere, somehow, the fires of 1842 are still burning, still transforming, still seeking the morning that brings justice. There are rumours, never confirmed, of a manuscript hidden somewhere in the Louisiana State Archives. Supposedly written by Celeste herself in the years after the fires, it contains not just her account of that burning summer, but instructions, formulas, and techniques that she developed. The document, if it exists, has never been released to the public. Some say this is because it contains information that could still be dangerous in the wrong hands. Others believe it's because it contains truths about American history that certain people would prefer remain ash and smoke. But perhaps the most persistent rumor is that Celeste never died, that someone who could walk through fire unburned had transformed into something beyond normal mortality. There are reports, scattered across decades and states, of a woman appearing at moments of racial violence or injustice, always preceded by unexplained warmth, always leaving behind that same symbol in ash or smoke or scorched earth. During the Tulsa massacre of 1921, survivors reported seeing a woman walking through the fires of Greenwood, and wherever she walked, the flames would not spread to certain buildings, preserving them against the destruction. During the Birmingham campaign of 1963, police dogs sent to attack protesters reportedly refused to advance past certain points, whimpering and backing away from invisible heat. These stories are dismissed by historians as folklore, the human tendency to seek supernatural explanation for incomprehensible events. But the consistency of the reports, across time and geography, suggests something more than coincidence. The woman is always described the same way, moving through fire without burning, radiating heat that can be felt but not always seen, leaving behind marks that resemble the symbol from 1842. She never speaks, never directly intervenes, but her presence seems to shift the balance of events, to create spaces where resistance becomes possible, where the oppressed find strength they didn't know they possessed. Environmental scientists studying climate change have noticed something odd about the sites of the 17 plantations. Despite being located in an area experiencing significant warming and ecological disruption, these specific locations show unusual stability. The soil maintains consistent temperature regardless of weather. Plant growth, while different from surrounding areas, shows remarkable resistance to disease and drought. Water tables remain steady even during dry periods. It's as if the land itself was fundamentally altered by the fires, transformed at a molecular level into something more resilient, more resistant to external pressures. One researcher, Dr. Amelia Harrison, has proposed that extreme heat events can sometimes create what she calls thermal memories in geological structures. The Earth itself, she suggests, can record and preserve energy patterns, playing them back under certain conditions. This might explain why sensitive equipment still detects temperature anomalies at the plantation sites, why some visitors report feeling sudden warmth on cold days, why photographs taken at these locations sometimes show unexplained light phenomena that weren't visible to the naked eye. But Dr. Harrison's most controversial claim is that these thermal memories might be interactive, responding to the presence and intentions of people who visit the sites. She cites instances where descendants of enslaved people report feeling energized and empowered at these locations, while descendants of plantation owners often experience unexplained anxiety or sudden illness. The land itself, she suggests, might have developed a kind of consciousness, an ability to recognize friend from foe based on criteria we don't fully understand. The story of the Ember Girl has inspired countless works of art, literature and music, each interpretation adding layers to the legend while potentially obscuring the historical truth. But perhaps this multiplication of meaning is itself part of Celeste's legacy. She demonstrated that a single person, armed with knowledge and determination, could challenge an entire system. That demonstration has been translated into 1,000 different languages of resistance, each community finding in her story the inspiration they need for their own struggles. In the end, whether Celeste was a real person who discovered extraordinary abilities, a composite figure created from multiple acts of resistance, or something else entirely matters less than what she represents. She embodies the principle that oppression creates its own opposition, that every act of cruelty plants seeds of its own destruction, that fire, whether literal or metaphorical, cannot be permanently contained by those who would use it to forge chains rather than break them. The 17 plantations that burned in 1842 were rebuilt or abandoned, their owners compensated by insurance or ruined by loss. But the system they represented, the idea that human beings could be owned and exploited without consequence, had been fundamentally challenged. A crack had formed in the foundation, a fissure through which flame could escape, and once fire finds a path it tends to follow it, growing wider and hotter until everything built on that flawed foundation comes tumbling down. Today, as new forms of oppression rise wearing different masks but showing the same cruel face, the story of the Ember Girl remains relevant. It reminds us that resistance doesn't always look like armies or legislation. Sometimes it looks like a young woman walking alone through the night, carrying nothing but determination and the knowledge that fire, properly applied, can transform the world. It reminds us that those who seem powerless might be gathering power in ways the powerful don't recognize until it's too late. It reminds us that justice, like fire, is patient but inexorable, and that morning always comes, no matter how long or dark the night. Some say if you know where to look, if you visit the right places at the right times, you can still find traces of the 17 fires. Not just the physical evidence, the melted glass and heat-altered soil, but something more, a feeling in the air like the moment before lightning strikes, a whisper in the wind that sounds like crackling flames, a warmth that comes not from the sun but from below, from the earth itself remembering what it means to burn for freedom. The fishermen on the Mississippi still tell the story, each generation adding their own details while preserving the essential truth. They speak of the girl who could not be burned because she had already been forged in the furnace of suffering, transformed by pressures that would have destroyed anyone weaker into something beyond ordinary human limitations. They say she proved that fire belongs to no one and everyone, that it serves whoever understands its nature and respects its power. And late at night, when the river fog rises and the air hangs thick with moisture that should prevent any flame from catching, they sometimes see lights dancing on the water, not reflections of anything on shore, not swamp gas or boats' lanterns, but something else. Points of light that move with purpose, that form patterns like constellations telling stories in a language older than words. They say if you can read those patterns, you'll understand what Celeste understood, that fire is just the visible manifestation of change, and change, once started, cannot be stopped, only directed. The story ends where it began, with the Mississippi River carrying secrets downstream. But now we know at least one of those secrets, the story of Celeste, the Ember Girl, who turned 17 plantations to ash, and in doing so illuminated a truth that many would prefer stayed hidden in darkness. That truth is simple and devastating. Every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction, and sometimes those seeds need only a single spark to burst into consuming flame. Whether Celeste still walks the earth, or whether she transformed into something beyond physical form, whether she was one person or many, whether the fires were supernatural or merely extraordinary, these questions matter less than the undeniable fact that 17 plantations burned in 1842. And with them burned the illusion that the powerful were untouchable, that the enslaved were powerless, that the way things were was the way they would always be. Fire, after all, is the most democratic of elements. It consumes the mansion as readily as the shack, respects no boundaries of class or race, transforms everything it touches into the same ash, and in that ash, if you know how to look, you can sometimes still see the symbol that Celeste left at every fire, that African sign for justice that comes with morning. It's a reminder that no night lasts forever, no matter how those who profit from darkness might wish otherwise, and that somewhere, someone is always tending a flame, waiting for the right moment to let it spread.